How to become invisible? This question concerns not only science fiction writers but also the military in every country around the world. Not so long ago, just a little over 150 years ago, military uniforms were still bright and colorful. Soldiers wore uniforms in all the colors of the rainbow, with shining buttons, elaborate aiguillettes, colorful sashes, sparkling epaulets, scarlet and white trousers, tall shakos with long multicolored plumes, and brass cuirassas and helmets gleaming in the sun and decorated with eagles. A soldier could be seen from far away, and it was impossible to confuse him with a civilian, or even with an inanimate object. This served two purposes. On the one hand, the intimidating appearance was meant to frighten the enemy. On the other hand, it allowed commanders to easily see their troops from a distance and distinguish one regiment from another. The most formidable units were further distinguished by particularly noticeable elements of their uniforms. For example, in the Russian army of the 18th century, artillerymen wore scarlet uniforms, while grenadiers wore tall caps with shiny brass front plates. At that time, no one even thought about camouflage. And yet, strangely enough, this already represented a form of camouflage, borrowed, perhaps unconsciously, from the world of insects and animals. Think of the huge eyes seen on the wings of butterflies or on the hood of the cobra. A butterfly cannot hide from the sharp eyes of a bird of prey. But when it suddenly spreads its wings, the attacker is confronted with enormous frightening eyes that resemble those of some unknown and presumably large animal. This may scare the predator and cause it to abandon its attempt to eat the prey. The cobra behaves in much the same way. When threatened, it rises up and spreads its hood, displaying eye-like markings. The predator is confused. Instead of a snake, it suddenly seems to face something large, unfamiliar, and frightening. In the animal world, there is a simple rule: anything unfamiliar may be dangerous and should be avoided. This is camouflage. It is not always necessary to become completely invisible to the enemy. That is extremely difficult, and often impossible. But appearing to be something other than what you really are, and thereby confusing the enemy, is much easier. A brilliant example of such camouflage occurred during the famous Battle of Poltava on June 27, 1709. The night before the battle, Peter the Great ordered the Novgorod regiment to exchange uniforms with the newly formed Ladoga regiment. The Novgorod soldiers wore blue uniforms, while the Ladoga regiment wore grey ones. Just as Peter expected, the Swedish army attacked the regiment wearing the grey uniforms, assuming they were inexperienced Russian recruits who could be easily crushed. Instead, they encountered the seasoned veterans of the Novgorod regiment, who had significant combat experience. The Swedes had been deceived by the color of the uniforms. Their attack was repelled. But this was not Peter's first experience with camouflage. During the second siege of Narva in the summer of 1704, he dressed 2 dragoon and 2 infantry regiments in Swedish uniforms. Using them, he staged a mock attack on the Russian troops besieging the fortress from the rear. The fortress commander fell for the trick and launched a sortie that nearly resulted in Narva's fall. However, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, camouflage was generally considered unnecessary. Cannons and muskets were fired at such short distances that it was practically impossible to hide. Moreover, battles were often decided not by gunfire but by hand-to-hand combat, where camouflage offered little advantage. Everything changed dramatically with the introduction of rapid-fire, long-range magazine rifles and even more powerful rifled artillery firing shells filled with high-explosive charges. Armies immediately began suffering enormous losses. A regiment standing in tight formation on the battlefield could be destroyed by rifle fire within an hour. Hiding soldiers in trenches helped only in defensive battles. Attacking lines of soldiers wearing bright uniforms became perfect targets for enemy marksmen. Now soldiers needed to be as inconspicuous as possible on the battlefield. The first warning sign came as early as 1854. During the very first battle of the Crimean War, fought on the Alma River, British riflemen killed all the Russian officers within half an hour. Their bright uniforms made them easy targets, especially since they differed significantly from those of ordinary soldiers. After that, the riflemen turned their fire on the soldiers. The answer to reducing such losses seemed obvious. Yet it took nearly half a century before the concept of military uniforms began to change. Between 1899 and 1902, the Second Boer War was fought in South Africa. The Boers were poor soldiers in the traditional sense. They were unfamiliar with tight infantry formations, marching to the rhythm of drums, or formal infantry tactics. They could not withstand a direct attack by British infantry. However, the Boers were excellent marksmen. From long distances they picked off British soldiers with accurate individual shots long before the British could deliver a coordinated volley. Meanwhile, the Boers themselves, wearing grey shirts and jackets made from dull fabric, were almost invisible against the background of burnt grass and brown earth. British officers were not fools. They quickly realized why their troops were suffering such heavy losses against South African farmers. The British Army became the first in the world to adopt uniforms whose color matched the South African bush. Sometimes this went to absurd extremes. Once the British realized the color saved lives, they began repainting everything that could possibly be painted. Uniforms and trousers, hats and boots, blankets and handkerchiefs, headquarters furniture and tents, belts and underwear, all were dyed the color of tobacco leaves. The most enthusiastic even attempted to paint cavalry horses, supply mules, and service dogs in drab colors. The Japanese, diligent students who often surpassed their teachers, quickly drew the appropriate conclusions. Following the British example, they dressed their army in uniforms whose color matched the terrain. The landscape of Southeast Asia had a different color palette from Africa, so the Japanese selected a tone somewhere between olive and yellow. It could not easily be called either one. In Japanese, the color was called khaki. Today, that word exists in nearly every language in the world. 2 years later, Japanese soldiers wearing khaki uniforms met Russian regiments on the fields of Manchuria during the Russo-Japanese War. The Russian military establishment had learned absolutely nothing from the Anglo-Boer War. In fact, most other countries had not learned much either. Even in United Kingdom, after long and heated debates, a compromise was reached. The traditional uniform would remain unchanged, but soldiers fighting in special theaters of war were allowed to wear drab-colored uniforms. As a result, during the Russo-Japanese War, Russian soldiers entered battle wearing white tunics and almost black trousers. Officers showed off dazzling white jackets with shining gold and silver epaulets, officer belts decorated with gold and silver braid, and colorful caps with white covers. Accurate fire from Japanese infantry, combined with the emerging use of machine guns, quickly discouraged Russian infantry from attacking in the traditional 19th century style. The Japanese fired while remaining almost invisible. Russian soldiers and officers were forced to repaint their uniforms in protective colors during the fighting itself. Between 1905 and 1914, military experts in various countries studied how the color of a uniform affected a soldier's visibility on the battlefield. They discovered that the most visible colors were white, bright yellow, black, blue, red, dark green, bright green, brown, and light blue. The least visible were yellow-brown, gray, blue-gray, olive, yellow-green-gray, and gray-blue. Many countries drew the correct conclusions from the Russo-Japanese War. However, introducing protective colors proved difficult for military institutions accustomed to bright, colorful uniforms. In Russia, protective color uniforms were widely adopted only in 1907. Sweden followed in 1906, Austria-Hungary in 1909, and Germany and Italy in 1910. The most conservative were the French. They began their first experiments with protective uniforms only in 1912. By the beginning of World War I, the new field uniforms were still sitting in warehouses. In their first attacks, French infantry went into battle wearing scarlet trousers, bright blue uniforms with huge red epaulets, and colorful kepis. Hard as it may be to believe, the French army adopted protective uniforms only by the summer of 1915. By the end of World War I, Russian soldiers wore a dull gray-yellow-green color, the British wore drab, the Germans wore feldgrau, a greenish-gray tone, and the French wore gray-blue uniforms. But once the experience of the war was analyzed, specialists reached a clear conclusion: a single protective color was not enough for reliable camouflage. A color that worked well in one environment could expose a soldier in another. Moreover, a large solid patch, the silhouette of a soldier wearing a uniform of a single color, still stood out against natural terrain, which rarely has a uniform color. For example, khaki was an excellent camouflage color in summer against burnt grass and shell-torn earth. But it appeared as a dull stain against the bright green of spring fields, or especially against snow in winter. The desire to create a uniform suitable for all types of terrain led to an important realization: it should not have a uniform color at all. The first idea of camouflage was that several colors should appear on clothing at the same time. This is how the now familiar camouflage pattern was born. However, achieving a perfect set of colors is practically impossible. At best, one can aim for an overall match: green tones for green landscapes, gray-yellow and gray-brown tones for sandy or desert terrain. Another question arises: how intense should the colors be? And how many colors should a camouflage pattern contain? Too many colors. And the few that actually match the terrain may not be enough to hide the soldier. Too few, and it is unlikely those exact colors will match the environment. Through trial and error, specialists eventually realized something important. Humans easily recognize objects whose outer and inner outlines are familiar to them. Often, the eye only needs to partially recognize an object for the brain to fill in the rest. Conversely, if an object is shown from an unusual angle, one we have never seen before, even a familiar object may not be recognized. A simple explanation of camouflage using the example of an ordinary plate was given by T. Gritz in the children's book Sharp Shooters. If you simply paint a plate with random ink spots, it becomes difficult to distinguish both against a white background and a black one. The observer sees only shapeless spots, but not the plate itself. At first glance, it might seem enough to paint uniforms in every possible color found in nature. But the reality is more complicated. Early designers of camouflage patterns started with this basic idea, and to some extent it still influences camouflage design today. However, scientists later realized that camouflage works not only because its colors match the environment. There are other factors. For instance, the same color changes as the distance between the observer and the object increases. Dust and water vapor in the air reduce color saturation, making distant objects appear duller. Artists know this phenomenon well and use it to create what they call perspective and depth in paintings. Objects in the foreground are painted in bright, rich tones, while distant objects appear muted and grayish. In short, it is not easy to ensure that an enemy sees something, but cannot recognize what it is. And if an object is not recognized, it is impossible to determine whether it is dangerous. That is the fundamental principle of camouflage. To remain invisible while being visible.